First thing to note about the offensive into Idlib is that, at least in public, the Syrian regime acknowledges that this is something that the Russians are keen for them not to pursue. But of course, Russia, by very successfully, it must be admitted, tilting the balance of military power in Syria to the favor of the regime, has led to a position where they actually don't have that many tools to restrain the Assad regime now militarily, even if they want to, when it suits their geopolitical interests to be seen as peace brokers. Because unlike when they intervened a couple of years back, Assad is not facing, predictions from all counts that he's going to potentially lose power, that the rebels and the jihadist groups are going to, push him out of large sections of Syria that they currently held. He's now very much on the front foot, so Russia will struggle, I think, to restrain the Assad regime, particularly
break it down for us.
Diminishment of ISIS.
Break it down for us. Why would Russia be against the Syrian offensive against the rebels in Idlib?
Well, Russia has positioned itself geopolitically to try and achieve a couple of goals in Syria since its intervention. The first being to prevent the fall of a major ally. They've been very stung by Western regime change efforts in, obviously, Iraq, but also Libya, for example. And they're determined that, given they have very strategically important port at Tartus, which is their only Mediterranean access port, and also they had interests with air power access, as they now have through Latakia, they wanted to maintain that and maintain President Assad's presence. But they also want to be seen as a power broker. Vladimir Putin's main geostrategic aim is to be seen as a top player and someone who needs to be consulted whenever there is some form of crisis. So if he can't then restrain and hold his own ally and supposedly more or less puppet to a peace deal that Russia helped broker with Turkey, which commits to these de-escalation ceasefire zones, of which Idlib is one, then that makes Russia's credibility as a sort of future peace negotiator, or at least power broker in future conflicts, much more suspect. The other thing to note, of course, is that Russia is pursuing a much more conciliatory relationship with Turkey now. It sees Turkey as a potential crack in the NATO alliance, particularly as President Erdogan moves further and further towards a sort of nationalist Islamist profile. And so with the recent agreed sale of the most advanced Russian air defense system, the S-400, to Turkey, Turkey is very, very opposed to the Syrian army retaking Idlib. And therefore, for Russia, this is also a thorny issue because Turkey's on the opposite side from them. So
who's behind these mysterious drone attacks?
Well, there's been an enormous amount of use of weaponized commercial drones by particularly ISIS, but lots of rebel groups on both sides. In Iraq and Syria, in particular Syria. We've also seen it in Yemen. And it's worth noting that the photos that emerged of the captured, crashed drones that were part of this supposed attack on the 5th and 6th against Russian facilities at Tartus and Latakia is very, very primitive components-wise. I mean, it's built out of commercially available, very, very primitive stuff. But it's nonetheless very effective. It's basically a model aeroplane with a GPS following capability, a la a smartphone, and a small explosive package. So this is not, the heavy level of sophistication that the Russian regime and the Russian Ministry of Defense is trying to, stress, because it's embarrassing for them that they've, suffered potentially damaging attacks on airfields, facilities, but also that, they're trying to tie this to potentially Western or even Turkish involvement by implication, saying, well, this has to be state-sponsored, it has to be state-supplied in terms of fusing, GPS, etc. The reality is that insurgent groups have been using this sort of improvised UAV technology for years now.
All right, so it's crude enough so that it could be anybody. Let me ask you about the shelling of Ghouta there, that eastern enclave of Damascus, and it's very brutal. Is this going to continue indefinitely?
I think as long as the Syrian civil war continues in its current guise, that is characterized by very large-scale, long-duration urban sieges, in effect. I think the latest report suggested more than 400,000 Syrians still living under siege in various parts of the country. Then, yes, this sort of shelling and aerial bombardment will continue. The sad fact is that for a Western public that, largely speaking, has grown used to seeing war portrayed with varying amounts of accuracy, as a relatively clean exercise fought with precision-guided munitions, exquisite technology, very, very minimal civilian casualties by previous conflict standards, it's difficult for us to have to admit and understand that, unfortunately, the Russian and Syrian regime approach of massively heavy bombardments, terror bombardments of besieged towns, Homs, Aleppo, and now Idlib and Ghouta as well, has proven extremely effective. It's not nice, but this is the Russian approach that was developed to deal with Grozny, first of all, where they basically flattened the entire city before taking it in the second conflict there. And it works. It's very inhumane, but it works.
And there's little, if no, response these days from the West.
I mean, we have a US president who clearly has a lot of personal admiration for the Russian president. And judging by his pushes to reportedly open up the rules of engagement constraints vis-à-vis collateral damage for coalition airstrikes, is certainly not overly personally concerned with collateral damage per se. And also, of course, from the West, there is no strategy for Syria. What we saw as the moderate Syrian opposition that came out of the initial Syrian revolution, Syrian civil war, is now very, very small in terms of parts of the country it holds. There's a lot of really fairly unpleasant hardline Islamist groups that are fighting Assad. And of course, the Assad regime is also still fighting ISIS, alongside the Kurds, who our own NATO allies, the Turks, can't stand. We don't have a plan for Syria. So it's very hard to even formulate a way we might try and get tough with the Russians, as it were, which you would have to do, who have a serious military presence in Syria and are carrying out a lot of this alongside the regime, without, at the very least, some sort of desired end goal that you could try and then leverage concessions towards.
Justin Bronk of the Royal United Services Institute, many thanks for being with us from London.